Central. I get a thumbs up from command. Everyone good? Shara? Okay, we're recording and our captioner is hopefully here and on. Is the captioning? It is, there it's going. Okay, wonderful. Hello, happy fall, happy October. I'm Allison Posey. I'm here with you live at CAST, which is in Wakefield, Massachusetts. And I'm really looking forward to this webinar today, and the participation from the field around and the enthusiasm around this webinar is really exciting. And I know you see the faces who you really want to have talking, but I'm not going to quite introduce them quite yet. I'm going to give a quick intro and a couple logistic pieces, and then I'm going to introduce our featured guests who are on the screen right now, then you can see them. And so thank you all for joining us live today. A good colleague of mine once said, students fail by design, and that was a comment that has really resonated with me. So our focus today is to really think about how can we design instructions so that all learners succeed. So in our webinar today, we have the opportunity to talk with two designers about user-centered design thinking process with the ultimate goal to transform. We're talking about transforming classrooms and schools. So before we begin with that, just a couple quick logistics. One of the things we mentioned for this webinar was that it was going to be hands-on, and I'm sure some of you went, wait a second, this is a webinar, how can this be hands-on? Well, here's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get you to contribute to the conversation today so that your hands can be on as soon as you leave, and hopefully as you're talking, but hopefully definitely you'll take some things that you'll want to be able to start getting your hands on. So we don't want to just talk as much as possible. Get out your notepads, get out some pieces of paper, some Post-it notes. We have some opportunities for you to be able to contribute to #CastPL or @GoalbookApp. And if you want to participate in the chat box, as many of you already are, you can open that chat panel from the upper left-hand corner of your Zoom window. And we ask that you choose all panelists and attendees from that drop-down box so that everyone can hear your thoughts and participate. However, if you have something, a comment or something that you have to say that you really think would distract people from the conversation, we ask that you make that comment to the panelists only, so we can again try to make sure that we address your concerns and talk about what you may be thinking about. But if it is something that you think might be distracting, we ask that you post to panelists only. So those are our logistic pieces, and so our goals for today are twofold. One, we hope to share an overview of design thinking, the design thinking process. We hope to brainstorm with you strategies to design instruction for all learners. And a lot of you have been sharing this, but we want to hear from you. What do you hope to gain from the discussion today? So please pause and reflect on the goals that you have. You took some valuable time out of your day to be here, and we're very grateful that you did. And we recognize that some of you may be joining at a different point watching the recording, and you too can continue to contribute to the conversation. We do ask that you use those Twitter feeds, the #CastPL and the @GoalbookApp. And so let us know, what are your goals for today? What do you hope to learn? And if we don't get to it today, we do hope that that this is just the beginning of the conversation, and that we'll be able to follow up with you above and beyond this introduction here. So we're getting some great feedback, some good conversation that you all are posting. Thank you for that. A lot of strategies. All learners, and definitely seeing that come up a lot. Excellent. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our two guests for today. So Shara Watkins is from Goalbook over in California. It looks like she's in the same room, but she's across the country from us. So Shara began her career in education on the East Coast in New York City in first grade and 6th and 8th grade ELA inclusive settings. She moved to the better weather. She worked as an instructional coach and a professional development lead. Since moving to California, Shara has supported a school district to implement more sustainable structures and systems, and she now supports implementation with Goalbook. She travels all over the U.S. to lead teacher trainings and facilitates Goalbook's Leadership Design Institutes for district instructional leaders. Shara, we're so happy to have you today.
Really excited to be here today. Thanks, Allison.
Excellent, excellent. And Kim Ducharme, who is in the room with me, which is very exciting. Hi. She heads up the design strategy and user experience for the development of interactive learning environments and tools that expand learning opportunities for all individuals through universal design for learning. She's the Director of Educational User Experience Design here at CAST. She leverages design thinking to catalyze innovation at CAST, leading the creative process from brainstorming through prototyping to product launch. A lifelong learner, educator, and creative problem solver, Kim is committed to harnessing the power of design to tackle the educational challenges of our time. Before joining CAST, Kim was with WGBH for 17 years, where some of my favorite television shows are from there, so I'm a fan, where she headed up the interactive design group and provided art direction and lead design on a variety of digital projects for major educational initiatives and national brands. So Kim, welcome. Thank you so much.
Great to be here.
For being here. So when we start to think about traditional design, it may have been something that we as educators maybe thought the curriculum developers would do, maybe thought the online folks should know how to do, or maybe instructional coaches should redesign a lesson for a student at a time. But with the Universal Design for Learning framework, UDL, I'll just start saying that, we strive to think about universal opportunities for learning that are designed from the start in the environment. And so today we're looking at the intersection of design thinking with UDL to really think about how we can deepen our understanding and practice even further. So Kim and Shara, when you think of putting the D in Universal Design for Learning, what comes to mind from your experience?
So I think about creative problem solving, really. That's goal-directed, contextual, and it's user-centered.
Yeah, so I think about, Goalbook is situated, as Allison mentioned, in Northern California. So we're in the heart of Silicon Valley, and design is something that really surrounds us and we're immersed in it. And so I definitely think about design in that context. And then it kind of brings me back to my experience in the classroom, where I think about the challenges of designing instruction that really met the needs of the wide range of learners. So kind of thinking about that intersection. So really excited to utilize that as we kind of move through the rest of today.
So as we were brainstorming, we noticed there are many different design frameworks that you may have seen before. But for today's conversation, we're going to hone in on one. So Kim, what is this one all about? This is getting started.
So today we're going to focus on the Sanfords IDO framework. It's really focused on citizen-centered design, user-centered design, student-centered, depends on who you're designing for, right? And what you see here are the typical phases. So emphasize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. So as you see, the first step for any design process is to empathize with your user. There's the next. Okay, good. Yep, that's great. So that leftmost box. So empathizing with your user. In many of your cases, that's the student you're designing for. And it's really about being ruthlessly curious, right? So the empathy, yeah. The empathy phase is about design research. There are many processes and tools for deepening empathy, such as you see here, interviews, observations, diary studies. If you're a teacher, you're probably up close and personal with your students on a daily basis.
Sometimes maybe learning a little more about your students than you may want.
So maybe the first question to grab your Sharpie and your Post-it and think about is, what are ways that you currently empathize with your users? So we want to just give you a minute to think about that and share in the chat or in Twitter. But just
Yes, you have a number of options. So get those little Post-it notes. You can tweet the cast_UDL or @Goalbook app, the hashtag CastPL. You could start writing some ideas on a piece of paper, take a picture of it, and tweet that out. If you have a number of people in a space together, I know a number of you said that you were sitting in groups, brainstorm some ideas, and again, at any point during the conversation, you can take a picture of it. So there's a great question, empathize, who are our users?
And what are ways? What are ways you currently empathize with your users, your students, whoever you are designing for? So we will give them a moment to think about that. Okay.
Yes, so if you're a teacher, your users would be students probably that you're designing for. This is great.
Yeah. This is great, seeing some of the ideas coming in, using direct feedback, start a conversation about understandings, about a topic, feelings, hugely important facets to be thinking about when empathizing, understanding what they're going through. So shall I go continue on and talk a little bit about one of the tools I use?
Yes, so please feel free to continue brainstorming and thinking some of this out. And as you do, Kim is going to share a tool that she uses to get to know her users a little bit more.
Right, so I encourage you to try some of these techniques, particularly the one I'm going to be sharing for empathy building, to give you a vantage point to see things that might be lost on you while you're in the hot seat teaching, right? You're pretty connected with your students, you're together with them all day, right? So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a scenario. So imagine you and your fellow teachers are teaching a class on circuits. And so here what you're seeing is a journey map that you might use for that lesson, right? And it shows the kind of activities over time that you would be teaching and the students would be learning around. So just imagine if you could go to a class and be a fly on the wall rather than be the teacher, kind of remove yourself, be a fly on the wall and just observe as they move through the lesson and annotate that journey map with your observations of their experience, right? And some of the things you're going to be thinking about are around kind of their emotions and their engagement, and you can bring in the principles of universal design for learning here. How are the options for engagement, representation, action, and expression impacting their emotions and their engagement during the lesson? So
I realized you weren't seeing Kim. There she is. Because it's my audio. So yeah, here we go.
I got
now
it.
they can see you. And
Okay.
here you go.
Great, great, great. Okay, so, and then on the next screen, right, if you advance one. So then sit with the students afterwards and go back over their learning journey and dig deeper on their highs and lows, their strengths, their pain points that can signal needs, right? And ask why a lot. Ask why and why is that and why is that. Dig deeper till you're out of answers and you'll be very surprised at all the insights that can come your way using this kind of tool and really taking yourself out of the seat of the teacher just to kind of observe and be curious, ruthlessly curious.
Ruthlessly curious. Yes, a really important term in there. And so couple thoughts initially when I think about journey mapping. One, that as we know from the brain science, emotions are central to cognition and basic physiology. So this is first addressing that emotion piece, but then fascinating to see how UDL then is, it's almost like we're having these lanes across the entire lesson that are really thinking about representation, action, expression, and engagement in there.
I call them swim lanes.
Swim lanes. There they are. Excellent, excellent. So Shara, when you think of empathizing and trying to build some of that initial empathy with your learners, what tips and strategies do you think of?
Yeah, so there are many strategies to get to the experience of learners. And I think, as Kim mentioned, and as that we really can't get to the truly understanding the problem without understanding it from the user's perspective. And so we are going to, before kind of applying this framework and design thinking and empathy to the educational context, I'm going to tell you a little design story in a moment. We're going to be talking about a story about a woman named Savitha. And as you listen, I want you to put yourself in Savitha's shoes. So you see this name tag here, right? You're going to wear that name tag. Hello, my name is. Your name is Savitha for the next couple of moments. And we're going to walk ourselves through this story, through this beginning, this middle, and this end of this story through Savitha's perspective, and really think about how the researchers in the story identify the goal, how they're working to empathize with her journey, and really thinking through the challenge through her perspective. So before I jump into this design story, I'm going to show you a picture of something. You can move on. And I want you to, in the chat box, take a moment, look at this picture and think about, what is this that you're seeing around the baby, and who would buy it? What do you think this is, and who would buy it? All right, I think some people think maybe it's a little bit like a swaddle, something that new parents might be using, something that maybe is almost like a sleeping bag for babies, for camping, something like that. Yep, possibly, yeah. So we can move to the next slide. This is actually, it looks like somebody maybe has heard this story before, yeah. So this is actually an infant warmer, an incubator. And so you can see two pictures here. This is called the Embrace Incubator. And next to that is a hospital incubator, what we've most typically probably seen. You can see that there's some differences here in terms of cost and in terms of kind of what they need to be able to function. But when we think about both of these, they're both intended to help babies keep their bodies warm. And so let's talk a little bit about where this came from. This is a solution. We're going to talk a little bit about the story here. So we'll move on. So there was a team of researchers and designers from Stanford, and they were faced with a challenge. You see two numbers here. That first number, 20 million, is the number of babies that are born at low birth weight or prematurely in developing countries each year. And these babies can't keep their bodies warm on their own. As a result, that second number is 450. That's the number of babies that die every hour in developing countries because they can't keep their bodies warm on their own. And incubators, such as the hospital incubators that we saw, are very rare. So this team of researchers was faced with these stark numbers, and they wanted to do something about it. So we can move on to the next slide. So they traveled to Nepal. And this team of researchers traveled to Nepal. They spent some time in the capital. They went to some hospitals, and then they decided, you know, we need to go to rural areas of Nepal where we notice that these rates are really high. And so they went to Nepal, and they met Savitha and Rani. And Savitha and Rani had just, you can click again, and you'll see a picture of Savitha there. Savitha had just given birth to Rani, And Ronnie was premature, and Ronnie was low birth weight, and Ronnie had a hard time keeping his body warm. And he was told, Savitha was told that she needed to go to the hospital. Well, the hospital was 4 hours away, and Savitha had no way to get to the hospital in order to get Ronnie to an incubator so that he could keep his body warm. And Ronnie died. And the team of researchers that were following Savitha and Ronnie and this story came across many other stories like that. And so there were some takeaways here, right? First, they noticed that the overwhelming majority of premature infants born in Nepal were born in rural areas. And most of these infants would never make it to a hospital because they couldn't. So the design for their new incubator, they were trying to create a new incubator and a design, it wouldn't work if it only worked at hospitals. They needed a local solution. It would have to be able to function in a rural environment. It would have to work without electricity. It would have to be inexpensive. And so they designed the Embrace Incubator. And so through this story, we have a moral. The moral of our story is, and we can go to the next slide now, is that design starts with empathizing with a specific individual. These researchers followed Savitha throughout her experience giving birth to Ronnie and not having a viable solution. And they were able to design something that worked for Savitha. And as we know with universal design, right, what worked for Savitha in this case would work for many other mothers and their children in that situation.
It really, I mean, it does immediately, a few UDL phrases came to mind. The context matters, and we often say, you know, design to the margins, although we've started trying to shift away from that language, recognizing that that margin is something that's contextualized. But I'm already, with my UDL hat, starting to see a few parallels to the story, and someone mentions who's sad, and I do just want to echo that really, you know, as you're telling the story, you were definitely hit by pangs of emotion, which is one of the core pieces that we've started talking about today.
Yeah. Yeah, what happens when we're able to really walk in the shoes of our users and really experience things through their angle. And so as we think about that, we can think about when we have goals that we want to achieve, we often have barriers in desirability and feasibility. And so we're really trying to think about the goal from the viewpoint of our user. So in this case, if we think about it through the perspective of Savitha, we consider that scenario, we consider the story, thinking about Savitha, thinking about her strengths in these areas or the strengths in the areas generally in this scenario and where they might get stuck. So what would be Savitha or people like Savitha, what would be their desire to want to achieve this goal of coming up with a incubator that works for a child like Ronnie? Where might be challenges and a desire to do so? And then how feasible is it to achieve that goal? And where might the barriers be? So just take a moment to kind of think about these two pieces around desirability and feasibility. We have this goal of wanting to kind of come up with a solution to fix this problem so we're not seeing those two numbers, 20 million and 450 an hour. Where's the desirability and feasibility, strengths and challenges? Take a moment to check that in.
And I see some folks are already starting to make the jump from the story to the classroom application, which is fabulous.
Yes, that's exactly where we'll be going next. So any thoughts about desirability and feasibility? Think in this, oh, go ahead, Allison.
I just, in my own head, the desirability almost seems twofold, that there's a desirability from the individual, but then there also needs to be the desirability from the designer to impact some of those changes.
Absolutely, yeah. And, you know, I'm seeing some of the comments here around, again, thinking about the educational context and around, you know, we often have that desire. In this case, Savitha, of course, has a desire for a solution that would work for a child like Ronnie or for Ronnie. And sometimes our biggest barrier comes in how we're able to make that feasible. And it looks like that's kind of a barrier that some folks are sharing here as well. Which I think is a nice segue to us as we think about, go back to this idea of design, go back to this idea of design thinking and making learning more universal.
Yes, it does all of a sudden put a whole new why this is so important to be able to do. And not just thinking about one individual, but again, thinking about the universal and universal design for learning, and thinking about how that design can be used for all and also in service of learning, which, as you know from the UDL guidelines, is defined at that expert level, being purposeful and resourceful and strategic and goal-directed and purposeful and motivated. So keeping the universal and the learning there, but through this design thinking process. So if we transition now and start to think a little bit more specifically now back to the classroom and the context of schools, let's talk about that a little bit, because it can seem the why certainly was here, and we were looking at one individual and one need, specifically that heat warmer. And whoa, classroom context, we're trying to get so much in, and we have so many different students that we're trying to work with. And a couple of the pieces that keep coming clear to me is the goal seems to be really important so far. But Kim, help us return to the classroom context a little bit here, and share what I've just posted to the screen.
Okay, so one of the outputs or artifacts of the empathy phase is this kind of range of what we call personas. And basically, out of the empathy research phase, you will typically have these archetypal personas that kind of have been teased out of your observations. And there's been synthesized into kind of a few sort of strengths and weaknesses around each of these users, and focused on the characteristics, right? Personas focused on characteristics, needs, not on demographics. So keep in mind that while it's true that even in each learner there's variability, right? You want to focus in on the brainstorming, the design thinking process around a limited set of problems. And then you repeat the process and you go back and try to solve for another user, another problem, et cetera. So what we're going to do today is focus in on one user. So let's focus in on Diego.
And I just really want to re-emphasize some of the subtleties in the language that you just shared, because what we're not doing is labeling learners and giving them a profile. So what this process is that I think was really key, and you stated it so subtly that I just want to make sure I say it out loud again, is we are addressing variability through brainstorming based on observations we've had and that we know about within our context. So I just want to see if either you, Shara, or Kim, want to highlight or re-emphasize that point in any other way, because I do think it is really important to recognize that this is not a profiling, labeling exercise, but a much broader.
Yeah, it's more like a freedom within limits exercise. I mean, that's part of the magic of design thinking, is that you can really, how do I put it? You can just really focus in on a single problem and go crazy brainstorming around what is the solution, right? So what we're going to do today is we're going to think about a single person, and we'll look at Diego.
Let's look at Diego. And in fact, we saw that there was a Diego on the webinar today. So hey, this one's for you.
Did you want to add anything before I go on, Shara?
Yeah, I was actually just going to echo that in terms of really moving away from kind of the profiling that can potentially happen is returning back to this idea of true empathy and how we're really building a true understanding of who our user is through a variety of different activities, which we'll go into. But I think just to highlight that it really starts with true empathy, right? It wasn't, when I think about the design story and the Stanford researchers, right, they didn't just read about a Savitha and Rani, they actually went to and experienced, walked through Savitha and Rani's life, you know, really stepped into her shoes. And so that's really important.
Yeah, that's key.
Yes, and I do like this comment, the idea of understanding, not categorizing, because we do know that those labels can really instill a fixed mindset that we really don't want to have as a result. Great, thank you both. That was really, really helpful. Okay, so let's play. Let's take a look now. Let's dive into one of these personas.
Right. So this is a very kind of winnowed down kind of persona to kind of the bare kind of strengths and challenges. So just take a moment to look at Diego and look at his strengths, his challenges. And we're going to be talking about literacy, just to put a certain lens. So you'll see some strengths, some challenges, and then there will be several kind of insights that come out of this. So those usually come in the form of problem statements, and there's just one of those many insights down at the bottom there.
So these would have been these comments about Diego would have been very contextualized too, to pieces that the teachers are seeing of Diego, and perhaps even with parents and with Diego, and just being able to talk about some of the strengths and some of the challenges in this particular context. So he's persistent, empathetic, and kind, loves to build things, but reads slowly and doesn't always comprehend, struggles with writing, easily frustrated, slow to process, and difficulty expressing ideas and talking specifics. So again, this is just getting a little bit of a focus that will help inform the design.
And even then, you might want to focus in on one of those pain points.
Right? Yeah. Great.
So then when we think about, after we've really built that empathy with our user, the next step as we move through this design process is this idea of defining the problem in a meaningful and actionable problem statement. So you saw some of those problem statements through Diego's, as we looked at kind of Diego's persona. But then we're also thinking about how this problem statement is situated in the context of Diego's environment and really focusing on his needs and insights as well. So we have Diego in mind, and so let's actually take a moment to consider the context in which Diego might be situated.
And this probably looks familiar for some of you. There's a school.
There is a school, although that does look like a very beautiful school building. So maybe. So
and I like the knowledge's power over the doorway there.
Yep. So let's pretend that this is Lincoln Elementary School, and it's a large urban school situated in an urban school district. And the focus at Lincoln Elementary over the past couple of years has been on reading instruction. Because students often enter Lincoln Elementary School many grade levels behind in their literacy skills. And so Lincoln Elementary has decided that they're going to really focus on reading instruction. And so they've attempted to do a couple of things to address some of these challenges in reading by investing in leveled books, by focusing on independent reading, and by increasing the number of coaches that are available to support teachers. And so these are some of the things that they have done. So as we kind of move forward here, we think about, okay, now we have a little bit more context about where Diego's situated. We have some information about Diego and what some of his strengths are and where some of his barriers lie. We can then really think about how we're defining this challenge by using a how might we statement. So we call these how might we statements, how might we questions that are focused on a particular persona. So in this case, we might create the following statement. How might we help Diego engage in independent reading? And so this is our design question focused on one persona, because again, as we think about the moral and we talked about with empathy, really design starts with empathizing with an individual user. Our individual user now is going to be Diego. And then we will maybe repeat this process for other users as well.
So if we could just pause for a moment and think, so there are a couple questions about being stuck on this problem statement. So they're saying it looks as though this should be a positive statement, but is it necessarily highlighting the problem, or is it highlighting a strength or a weakness, is one of the clarifying questions.
Yep, I'll let you speak to that, Shara.
Shara, do you want to take that?
Yeah, definitely. So when we think about the how might we statements, we're thinking about the context, and we're thinking about the student, and we are thinking about, really thinking about clarifying what the challenge or, problem is. And so in this case, the challenge might be getting Diego to engage in independent reading, or supporting students in general to engage in independent reading. And so if that's something that's not going well, we've learned that that is a challenge through our empathy with Diego, and we're thinking about whatever the goal might be that we have for him, which is around really improving that reading. So then combining his strengths and areas for growth, combining with what our goal is, then we're coming up with this problem statement, or this how might we statement, to really think about gearing us towards these next steps, which is then to think about solutions. So if we go kind of back to the story about Savitha and Ronnie, right, we have this picture, this picture with data, which is around how many babies are born prematurely and with low birth weight. And then we have so that's kind of our context. And then we have our user, which is Savitha and Ronnie, and we're learning about the challenge through them. Well, we have a goal to kind of solve this problem. And so when we think about the context, and then when we think about our user, then we could create a how might we statement for that as well. We're thinking about how might we help Savitha, with a solution to help her keep Ronnie warm while he's continuing to grow, or something like that. I'm kind of just thinking about one on the fly, but that's kind of what we're doing as we're thinking about these problem statements.
And just a little bit in the weeds, but there's this term problem statement, and there's this thing called a brainstorming question, and how might we kind of signal that brainstorming question? So many questions might come out of a problem statement. So I don't know if that also helps. So the problem statement typically, let me go back to it. It highlights a need and paired with an insight you might have had when you were observing, doing your research, and then out of that you can think of a bunch of how might we brainstorming questions. So this is one of those.
Well, it's helpful because there, is some question of, wait a minute, I can't now go get to know each and every one of my students, and but you don't need to really. Again, remember that the approach to thinking about Diego is to get to that empathy piece, and to contextualize it and think about it in terms of a design question that is rooted in data of some sort. And then the goal is really to follow the problem and to recognize that it can really ground to really think deeply about Diego. So then once you've defined the problem, you really then start to ideate. So Kim, do you want to shout out about this one a little bit? Or Shara?
So yeah, I mean, ideating is really, that's the brainstorming. And this is kind of the really fun part. And there are all sorts of tricks and Post-its flying around. It's a time to think blue sky, and a time to not edit or censor yourself in the ideas. And in a best case scenario, the brainstorm would be happening with a cross-disciplinary set of people, right? Many different kinds of thinkers attacking the problem different ways, sharing those ideas, and cross-pollinating and thinking of things you might never have thought about before.
Oh, that's great, because sometimes you really, when you get outside of your own field, you start to get ideas you maybe hadn't thought of before. And this also, of course, makes me laugh a little bit. Here's maybe where you could pull out those UDL guidelines and say, oh, wait a minute, here are a whole bunch of different strategies. In fact, 29 different checkpoints that we might just start throwing out to ideate, because as you say, this is like the free fun pie in the sky brainstorming process. Shara, did you want to add to that at all?
No, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think the biggest takeaway from this phase is that you're really just, throwing, as the quote says here, right? You're generating the broadest range of possibilities here. You're really just throwing everything out there, because we, until we kind of have all options on the table, we can often get stuck in limiting ourselves to maybe what we've already tried, or, what we think is possible. And that's when we go back to that desirability versus feasibility, but we're just kind of throwing it all out there at this phase. So yeah, and when we think about that in the context of Diego and the how might we statement, we generated a couple of possibilities, and then want to hear from you guys around some of yours. So if we think about how might we help Diego engage in independent reading, we threw out a couple here, maybe a reading log, or maybe some goal setting, or maybe using peer buddies, or a first then board, right? These are just a couple of ideas that we threw out here, but would love for you guys to throw out some ideas that you might, think about as we're kind of in this ideating phase here, or experimenting, or just throwing out some ideas. So let's have some folks chat that in.
So these are fun, the PVC pipe type phones. This is one of my favorite tools for myself even.
Yep, internal motivations, yeah, culturally relevance, high interest, so important. And again, gets back to the empathy of us. If we really understand what those are, right, then we're able to provide that. But if we don't, then we have a block there. Absolutely. Yep.
These are great. Yes.
Okay, just while you're thinking, I just want to comment on Sandra's comment about silos. So very insightful. I find that silos within our institution work against really effective brainstorming or ideation. That is so true. So I think it's just really about learning about the values of brainstorming or design thinking and cross-disciplinary innovation, right? Grab the secretary down the hall and the janitor and the parents, and, yeah.
It is. I mean, even, you might even look at some of these strategies and like reading logs and say, oh, I've done reading logs before, but contextualizing it within this framework for thinking about Diego and thinking about empathy and thinking about the goals. The more ideas, the more insights you can get to it. Really, the better designer you can be for all learners then, which ultimately is who we're going for.
Pair reading with visual, these are awesome. Read to a dog. Was that you, Mindy?
This is all possibilities, right?
Yeah. That's exactly right. Excellent, excellent. So thank you all for helping ideate. But wow, that feels overwhelming. There are so many ideas. How do I ever begin to narrow it down, especially as we know at the pace of the school year can be a little overwhelming and fast-paced. So how do we get to this prototyping stage?
Yeah, so I mean, when we think about prototyping, this is where we're really selecting one of our ideas. We're really choosing one of the solutions, and then we're building it. We're building out a prototype. We're building out something that we want to test out, that we want to try with our students, and to see if it works. And so we have one solution that we kind of decided, let's prototype this and think about how we might actually test this out. And so this is a goal setting, planning, and reflection worksheet that we might do as an educator with Diego. And this is a resource that we have in Goalbook.
And all learners. Just because I have to, yes, we would think about Diego and maybe initially design it for him, but then we would make it available for all learners. But yeah, okay, sorry, Shara.
No, absolutely, absolutely. Because likely what we know is something that would be beneficial for Diego would also be beneficial for other students. So absolutely. So we might test something like this out with Diego and a group of students where we collaboratively set some goals around independent reading. And so you notice that in this goal planning document, there are pieces here around Diego setting some goals and identifying some obstacles and thinking about tools and both how Diego and the educator together would work together to support him in achieving this goal, right? So it's not one-sided. But yeah.
And Diego and his other folks in the group, and, it definitely could be, doesn't necessarily just need to be teacher to learner, but yeah, again, opening up some of those other options.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then as I think Allison, thinking about the UDL piece, there's this resource also aligned to UDL checkpoints around guiding appropriate goal setting. And so one of the things that we do at Goalbook is we build out resources that are aligned to those checkpoints. So we'll give you access to some others of these at the end of the session, but wanted to point that out.
I actually, keep going, sorry.
That was it.
Oh, it did, my head immediately went to, wow, we are guiding appropriate goal setting. That's under the executive function guidelines. So we're in the blue column up at the top if you're using version 3.0. So yeah, again, these may all be strategies that you've used before, but this deeper reflection for how you are empathizing, how you are getting in the shoes, you are thinking of the pain points, how you're defining a problem, so you know what you're even trying to solve, and that could be driven, from data or feedback, and then you're ideating pie in the sky, then you're actually prototyping and designing. You're starting to narrow it down a little bit, and then ultimately the really exciting part is that you begin to test it out. So do you want to speak to this one, or?
Yeah, sure. So, right. So this is, prototyping is experimenting. You're kind of soliciting feedback. So you're either, running a very kind of mini pilot test, you're trying it out in the classroom or on the side, and seeing really what your users think of it. I think I saw a comment go by, I don't remember it exactly, but it's like, what if the problem of what if somebody thinks something works and somebody else doesn't? This is the beauty of design thinking. It's evidence-based decision making, right? The user is the true kind of litmus test. Does it work for them or not? And what if it fails, right? That's a probability, right? So you go back to the empathy. It didn't really fail because you know more now, right? So
some of the best learning comes from making those mistakes, right, and having it not work.
Back to the empathy stage, and you say, what was going on for you there? Why? And why was that? Etc. And so design thinking doesn't end at the test phase necessarily, and it's really a mindset, and it's all iterative. So these should have kind of arrows going around.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Shara, did you want to add to that, thinking about the test phase here?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that was a good kind of overview of the test phrase. I think that after we're testing this out, we're going back through and then we're seeing what else we're learning here about our students and continuing to build that empathy and go through this again. So absolutely.
And that's the beauty and excitement of learning, is that we know that we're not going to get a single solution that's going to work for everyone, that then the next year, or even if you have something amazing that's developed and we're able to really achieve a lot of the learning outcomes we want, then your learners the next year come along and it may not work with them. So we do know that this is an iterative kind of process that we do need to continue to brainstorm around, and no one single tool will be the magic answer. Unfortunately, we don't have that magic tool again for you today, but we do have a lot of resources for you to begin to think about in terms of next steps. So we've created a Google Drive, and you can follow to this bit.ly link here. If you have any resources that you would like to add, or if you did some brainstorming today from your session and you want to upload some documents, or maybe you have ideas for Diego that you would like to add, we have this Google Drive that has a whole lot of resources in it already. So the journey map that you saw, the personas you saw today, the Hello, My Name Is worksheet that you saw today. Shara, there were a ton of resources that you shared from Goalbook. Do you want to just highlight any of those or mention any of those that are in this Google Drive?
Yep, absolutely. So, what's interesting about talking through this process is, as we're coming up with strategies and resources to support educators, this is a process that our team is going through. And so we're ideating, we're prototyping. So we have some prototypes in there and some resources that are for you to test out and give us feedback on.
That's great.
We're going to make this very meta here, but it's absolutely true. And yeah, so there's some resources similar. So the goal setting document is in there, and some other resources around things like community circle, or things like kind of doing some peer buddy work, and other things around students engaging in empathetic listening. So there's some different resources there that you can utilize that both support empathy kind of teacher to student, but also support empathy student to student. And so some great resources that you can utilize, hopefully in implementing your classroom, if you're an educator, classroom tomorrow. The other piece that I do want to point out here, because I did see a comment earlier, is around, our users can change. And so if your user isn't a student, and somebody mentioned something about what if your user is an educator, if you're a principal, or if you're working at the district level and your users aren't students, right? This process is the same as we think about, we're just thinking about our user being different. And so, and our key takeaway, of course, is around this empathy building, and that being the first step to being able to really engage in some activities and some processes that you're already doing, but really wanting to start with this piece around empathy.
It's really, it's interesting because we talk about UDL as a framework that's taking into mind goals, variability, design of the context before you even get to the UDL guidelines. And the layer that this is adding to this is to that UDL framework and the UDL guidelines is really then thinking about the empathy and really trying to build out what some of those core features are that are focused in on a particular problemtunity, because that is just the greatest word for this problem of practice that could be based on some data, it could be based on some feedback, and you're really being that strong observer of your own context and your own needs. And so, so we do think this is a really exciting alignment of a number of different frameworks together. One other one that we thought you all might be interested in taking a look at is called this design kit, and it's from IDEO. And it again is just filled with resources that you could make use of when you're thinking about. Did you want to comment, either of you, on this design kit from IDEO?
I guess the thing I would leave you with is, as you get more familiar with the process and skilled with the process, you will learn how to pick and choose the right tools for the moment. So, and these are just super wonderful user-friendly tools that are available for you to experiment with yourself.
And one of the things we do hope happens is that it's not just that teachers are giving them to learners, but learners are able to make good use of them themselves and know how to translate it across outside of the classroom into their own world. And so if you do have questions for our guests today, we would love to hear some of your thoughts, maybe something you're still wrestling with. You can, of course, engage more with CAST. We're going to announce our summer symposium soon, and we have research and development and professional publishing and professional learning. You can engage more with Goalbook. Shara, do you want to explain or share a little bit here about some of the Goalbook opportunities?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have two kind of ways to engage with Goalbook. So some of the resources that are in that folder, the goal setting document, and some of those other documents are accessible through our Goalbook platform, and which is a software to support educators. So if you are interested in learning more or speaking to somebody at Goalbook, you can visit goalbookapp.com, and there's a way for you to learn more about the products that we have to offer. And I know that there are some folks on here that are Goalbook users already, so thank you for being here. And then in addition to kind of the tools and resources that we have within our platform, we also offer a Leadership Design Institute. And so if we go to the next slide, we actually have a quote from Margaret out of the UDL state coordinator from Mississippi. And one of the things that she kind of highlights is that when she saw things from a teacher's perspective, she realized the core of the challenge was student engagement. And so Margaret attended our Leadership Design Institute this past July, and we will be offering 2 more institutes, one in January in the Bay Area and one in July in New York City. And so you can learn more about that by visiting goalbookapp.com/LDI, which was just put into the chat. And so if you are interested in learning more about that or sending a team, the other thing that I'll add on to that is that if you have a district leadership team that's interested in an individualized Leadership Design Institute for your whole team, that's something that we offer as well, where we'll come and do some work with your team in your own context. So you can reach out to me, and you guys can put my email in there in the chat box, which I think is listed here in the slide, so you can reach out to me directly about that as I lead that work.
Excellent, excellent. Lots of great learning opportunities. And sometimes I think I understand, but when I really do stop and dig deeper, I end up learning a lot more. So I think taking time to pause and really to dig into that empathy piece is always worth the time, So we want to thank you all for participating with us today. We'd love to, have feedback. We have tinyurl.com UDL webinar where you can share some feedback with us. And if you have questions, we'll stay on for another couple of minutes. But yes, we are really hoping, thank you, Mindy has posted the correct link in the chat box there. And thank you for all of you for being with us today. We see a lot of familiar names and faces. It's fabulous to have you. And as we look to design and keep the UDL in UDL, we really do want to continue to have the conversation and to learn from you. So thank you to our captioner today. Thank you to Mindy and Allie for helping with all the back channel support. And thank you to Kim and Shara for being with us today. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. So great to have you with us this afternoon. Have a good one.